The story of ancient Greece often begins with marble temples, golden statues, and philosophers walking in the sunlit courtyards of Athens. But beneath those gleaming surfaces lay a truth rarely celebrated. The brilliance of Greek society was built on the backs of the enslaved. For every thinker debating virtue, for every athlete crowned with laurel leaves, there were countless men, women, and children living and dying in bondage. Their labor, the invisible foundation of freedom. Imagine the silver mines of Laurion, south of Athens. The air thick with dust, the walls slick with moisture. The only light from oil lamps that barely pierced the suffocating darkness. Here, enslaved people, many of them war captives or children sold by desperate families, crawled through tunnels so narrow they could not stand upright. Shackles often bound their ankles, making flight impossible. Their task was to hack silver ore from the rock and haul it to the surface, where it would be smelted into coinage that financed Athens' navy, its monuments, its very democracy. When Pericles boasted of Athens as the school of Hellas, it was silver mined by broken backs that paid the tuition. In Sparta, the system was no less brutal, though it wore a different face. The helots were not purchased on foreign markets, but were instead an entire subjugated population, fellow Greeks of Messenian origin, conquered in ancient wars and condemned to generations of servitude. Unlike household slaves in Athens, helots were bound to the land. They tilled the soil, harvested the grain, pressed the olives, and tended the vineyards that fed Spartan citizens. Yet, their labor was performed under constant threat. Every year, Spartan magistrates declared ritual war on the helots, granting young men of the Crypteia the legal right to stalk and kill those considered rebellious or simply too strong. Terror was not incidental. It was policy designed to keep the enslaved majority in check. Across the Greek world, the enslaved were everywhere. In households, they cooked meals, nursed infants, and cleaned homes. In workshops, they crafted pottery, leather goods, and weapons. In fields, they bent under the sun, sowing and reaping what citizens consumed at their symposia. They were present in schools as tutors or pedagogues, often more educated than the children they supervised. Even in temples, priests commanded enslaved laborers to maintain the sacred fires. Yet, their presence was paradoxical. The same Athenians who proclaimed the value of liberty and equality among citizens accepted without question the bondage of others. To them, freedom was a relative term. It existed only in contrast to the condition of those enslaved. Philosophers wrestled with this contradiction. Aristotle argued that some people were natural slaves destined to be ruled. Others, like Euripides in his tragedies, hinted at the cruelty of fate that could reduce a once free person to servitude. Still, the system persisted unquestioned, by most normalized to the point of invisibility. Numbers tell part of the story. In Athens at its height, scholars estimate that slaves made up a third, perhaps even half of the population. In Sparta, helots outnumbered citizens by as much as 7-1. This imbalance explains the constant anxiety of revolt. Rebellions did erupt, especially in Messenia, where helots rose against their Spartan overlords in bloody wars. Each time they were crushed, but the memory lingered, fueling both Spartan brutality and helot desperation. The daily lives of the enslaved varied drastically. A household servant in a wealthy Athenian home might live more comfortably than a free peasant in the countryside, though always under the shadow of being property. A mine worker, by contrast, might survive only a handful of years before injury, disease, or exhaustion claimed him. Some slaves, particularly those skilled in trades, were allowed to keep a portion of their earnings and might eventually buy their freedom. Others were manumitted as acts of gratitude or piety. Yet, freedom was never guaranteed. Even a freed slave carried the stigma of their origins, bound by obligations to their former masters. There were glimpses of resistance. Enslaved people fled, hid, and occasionally found refuge in sanctuaries dedicated to the gods. Some formed bonds of solidarity, whispering stories of freedom in the dark corners of workshops and fields. The largest rebellions, though rare, shook Greek society to its core, exposing the fragility of a system that depended so heavily on human chains. But perhaps the most haunting aspect is how little their voices remain. The grand speeches of Pericles survive, the biting comedies of Aristophanes echo across centuries. But the words of those who dug the silver, harvested the grain, and bore the scars are lost. What we know comes filtered through the accounts of their masters, fragments of contracts, complaints of disobedience, records of sales. In these cold documents, human beings appear as numbers commodities with listed skills, defects, and prices. And yet, in those fragments, we glimpse humanity breaking through. A sales record noting a boy's musical ability, a contract describing a woman's role as a wet nurse, a lawsuit over the mistreatment of an enslaved craftsman who produced valuable goods. These details remind us that behind the statistics were individuals with talents, dreams, and fears. The irony is stark. The civilization that gave the world the concept of democracy did so while denying humanity to so many. Freedom in Greece was real, but it was exclusive. To be a citizen meant to own others, or at least to live in a society where others bore the burdens of your liberty. The agora buzzed with debate because the fields were ploughed by slaves. Philosophers questioned the cosmos because they did not need to worry about daily labor. The splendor of Greek culture rested on invisible shoulders. To understand Greece fully, we must begin here in the darkness of the mines, in the fields of the helots, in the crowded quarters of households where nameless men and women labored without recognition. They were the foundation stones of temples, the oarsmen of triremes, the silent chorus behind every triumph. Their suffering is woven into the brilliance we still admire, and until we acknowledge them, the story of Greece remains incomplete. In Sparta, the concept of life itself began not with a lullaby, but with judgment. Birth was not a guarantee of survival, nor was a newborn child welcomed automatically into the embrace of the community. Instead, the first test of citizenship came at the moment of breath. To the Spartans who prized strength and discipline above all else, infancy was not a sacred stage of innocence. It was a crucible. Picture a mother in a modest dwelling in Laconia, cradling her newborn after hours of pain. Her face is tired, her arms trembling as she wraps the child in swaddling cloth. But soon, the infant will not rest in her care. Custom dictated that the baby be presented to a council of elders, men hardened by years of military service. These were not doctors or midwives, but judges of worth. They examined the infant carefully, its limbs, its posture, its cry, even the steadiness of its gaze. If the child appeared healthy, sturdy, and capable of future strength, it was returned to the family to be raised as a Spartan citizen. But If the elders found weakness, whether a visible deformity, frailty, or anything that suggested future burden, the verdict was grim. The infant would be taken to the foot of Mount Taygetus, to a place called the apotheta, the deposits. There it was left exposed to the elements, to die of cold hunger or to be taken by wild animals. This practice of exposure was not unique to Sparta. Other Greek city-states also abandoned unwanted infants, often due to poverty, illegitimacy, or deformity. But in Sparta, it was institutionalized, woven into law and ritual, a matter not of family choice, but of civic duty. The survival of the state demanded the elimination of weakness. It is difficult, even horrifying, for modern sensibilities to grasp. Yet, within Spartan logic, the reasoning was clear. In a society where every citizen male was destined to become a soldier, and every female to bear future warriors, the community could not afford to expend resources on those deemed unable to contribute. The state came before the individual. The child's life was weighed against the survival of Sparta itself. Still, exposure was not always a sentence of death. In some cases, infants left on the hillsides were rescued by strangers, sometimes raised as slaves or adopted by families in need of children. Ancient sources whisper of such rescues, though the fate of most is lost to silence. To the Spartans, mercy was not the point. The ritual of exposure reaffirmed the values of the community discipline. Endurance, the primacy of the strong. Women, too, were shaped by this harsh beginning. Spartan mothers were expected to endure the loss of weak children without outward mourning. The philosopher Plutarch records the famous saying attributed to Spartan women, "Come back with your shield or on it." This attitude, stoic, uncompromising, began at the cradle. For a Spartan woman, the pain of exposure was an unspoken burden borne in service to the polis. Her role was not only to give birth, but to give Sparta soldiers. Exposure also reflected the broader Greek belief in the malleability of life. The gods had given existence, but society decided its worth. Unlike Christian traditions that would later sanctify the life of every child, the ancient world often saw infants as liminal beings, not fully members of the human community until accepted through ritual. In Athens, for example, a child was formally introduced to the household only after the amphidromia ceremony, several days after birth. In Sparta, the equivalent ritual was exposure, a brutal form of initiation into belonging. The consequences of this system echoed through Spartan society. With weak and sickly infants culled, the population remained small, elite, and tightly controlled. Unlike populous Athens, Sparta was always a minority ruling class surrounded by helots. The exposure practice reinforced this exclusivity. Only the fittest could join the warrior caste. Yet, it also sowed seeds of fragility. Because fewer infants were allowed to grow, Sparta's citizen population never recovered from losses in war, contributing to its decline in later centuries. Philosophers outside Sparta often criticized the practice. Aristotle, though he accepted the idea of selective breeding, condemned Sparta for allowing the exposure of too many children, weakening the state's long-term survival. Other Greeks regarded Spartan customs as both admirable and monstrous, admirable for their discipline, monstrous for their cruelty. For the infants themselves, the voices are lost. But one cannot help but imagine the hillside at Mount Taygetus, the wind sweeping through pines, the cries of abandoned children fading into silence. Each of those tiny bodies represented not only a life denied, but a choice, made by a society that prized the collective above the individual. Yet, to understand Sparta, one must accept this paradox. Their strength, their legendary military prowess, their iron discipline, all were born from practices that modern sensibilities recoil from. To the Spartans, cruelty was not cruelty if it served the survival of the state. It was necessity, duty, and even honor. The story of Spartan birth and exposure reminds us that civilizations often define themselves not just by what they celebrate, but by what they reject. And in Sparta, the rejection of weakness was absolute. The path to becoming a Spartan began not with nurture, but with a test one that many never survived. Marriage in Sparta was not a private matter of love or affection. It was like almost everything else in that militarized society, a civic ritual designed to serve the state. Unlike in Athens, where a bride's dowry and her family's prestige dictated the arrangement in Sparta, marriage was stripped of romance, stripped even of outward ceremony. What mattered was not personal desire, but the production of strong, healthy children, future warriors and mothers of warriors. The wedding night in Sparta was unlike any other in Greece. According to Plutarch, when a woman was married, her head was shaved, her body clothed in a man's cloak and sandals, and she was led to a darkened room. There she waited for her husband, who would slip in, secretly consummate the marriage, and depart before dawn. The husband, no matter his age, continued to live in the communal barracks with his fellow warriors, eating and sleeping among men until he reached the age of 30. Marriage then was not cohabitation, but an encounter, furtive, restrained, and bound tightly to the rhythms of military duty. To modern eyes, the practice of shaving the bride's head and dressing her as a man may seem bizarre, even humiliating. Yet, within the Spartan logic, it served a practical function. Men who had lived their lives almost entirely in male company drilled in the agog. From childhood might feel awkward or inexperienced approaching a woman. By disguising the bride as masculine on that first night, the transition from brotherhood to marriage was made less jarring. Over time, as husband and wife met in secret encounters, she grew her hair again and assumed her traditional female appearance. Marriage was further complicated by the Spartan obsession with eugenics. Procreation was viewed as a civic duty, and producing strong children as a contribution to the state's survival. Older men without heirs sometimes encouraged younger, stronger men to impregnate their wives, ensuring the family line would not weaken. In other cases, respected warriors might lend their wives temporarily, if the state or family believed it would result in sturdier offspring. These arrangements, shocking to outsiders, were not acts of infidelity in Spartan eyes. They were pragmatic solutions, subordinating private jealousy to public necessity. The communal approach to procreation reflected the Spartan conviction that children belonged less to their parents than to the city. A son born of such an arrangement was no less legitimate, for what mattered was not the fidelity of the marriage bed, but the strength of the warrior produced. To Athens or Corinth, this blurring of marital fidelity looked like moral laxity. To Sparta, it was patriotism. The secrecy of Spartan marriages also meant that affection could grow slowly without the trappings of daily domestic life. Couples might only see each other in stolen moments, and the thrill of such encounters was said to deepen passion. Some ancient commentators even suggested that this secrecy fostered stronger bonds, since longing was stretched out across years. Yet, there was also a cost. Many Spartan women lived in partial solitude, managing households and estates, while their husbands remained bound to their barracks. Spartan women, however, were far from powerless. Unlike their Athenian counterparts, they owned property-managed estates and spoke with unusual freedom. While their marriages may have begun in darkness and disguise their authority in daily life was unmistakable. A Spartan mother famously told her son as he went to war, "Return with your shield, or on it." Her voice was not a whisper in the home, but a command in the public square. Thus, marriage in Sparta embodied the paradox of the city itself. Rigid discipline mingled with unusual freedoms, harsh rituals alongside female authority. A bride stripped of her hair and dressed as a man entered her marriage, not as a cherished partner in a household, but as a participant in a larger system of survival. She became a vessel for the state's ambitions, even as she retained power over property and speech. Where other Greek cities celebrated weddings with processions, feasts, and hymns, to Hera Sparta chose silence and shadows. Their marriages were not spectacles of joy, but strategies of endurance. To the Spartans, love was secondary. What mattered was legacy. And so, in their strange and secretive unions, we glimpse a society that bent even intimacy to the service of the state. If Spartan marriage reduced love to duty, Thebes elevated love into strategy. Few military units in history carried a reputation as paradoxical and poignant as the Sacred Band of Thebes, an army of lovers who fought and died side by side. Formed in the early 4th century BCE, the Sacred Band was composed of 300 men, organized not by rank or wealth, but by intimacy. 150 pairs of male lovers, each sworn to defend not only their city, but the partner who fought at their side. The logic was daring, even radical. Thebans believed that no soldier would abandon his lover in the heat of battle. No one would flee while the eyes of his beloved watched. Mutual devotion, it was thought, could forge courage stronger than gold or oaths. Plutarch later remarked that such bonds created an army cemented by love, a force where loyalty was not just civic, but deeply personal. The Sacred Band did not exist in isolation from Greek culture. Greek city-states often tolerated or even celebrated male-male intimacy, particularly when tied to mentorship and virtue. Yet Thebes went further, institutionalizing it into the heart of its military. Where Athens or Sparta saw love as private or educational, Thebes turned it into a weapon. Their first major test came in the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE. The Thebans faced Sparta, the greatest military power of the age. Sparta had dominated Greece for decades, its hoplites feared across the Mediterranean. But on that day, the Sacred Band, stationed in the vanguard of the Theban line, charged with ferocity that shocked the disciplined Spartans. Fighting as if each blow shielded not just their city, but their beloved, they helped deliver a crushing defeat. Leuctra shattered Spartan supremacy, and the Sacred Band's legend was born. Accounts describe them as not merely effective, but terrifying in their unity. Where other units might falter, they held firm, each pair moving with uncanny cohesion. Their devotion translated into military innovation. Thebes pioneered the deep phalanx formation, stacking ranks 50 men deep, and the Sacred Band anchored this wall of spears with unbreakable determination. Victory at Leuctra altered the map of Greece, proving that even Sparta could bleed. For decades, the Sacred Band remained the pride of Thebes, a symbol of its independence and brilliance. Parents entrusted their sons not only to serve the city, but to serve in bonds of love that sharpened both courage and honor. In a culture that prized masculine valor, Thebes proclaimed that love between men was not weakness, but strength, a virtue capable of toppling empires. Yet, their story carried tragedy, as well as triumph. In 338 BCE, at the Battle of Chaeronea, the Sacred Band faced Philip II of Macedon and his son Alexander, the future conqueror, who would carve his empire across Asia. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the Thebans stood their ground until the very last man. When Philip surveyed the battlefield, he found their corpses lying in pairs, each lover fallen beside his partner. He is said to have wept, declaring that such devotion was beyond ridicule, even in defeat. The burial site of the Sacred Band still exists today, marked by the Lion of Chaeronea. Beneath its stone gaze lie rows of warriors whose bond was both personal and political, intimate and martial. Their story reminds us that love can be weaponized not only by tyrants, as in Rome's palaces, but also by free cities, binding men together in the crucible of war. In their loyalty, the Sacred Band of Thebes inverted expectations. Where Sparta stripped marriage of intimacy for civic duty, Thebes turned intimacy itself into civic duty. They proved that devotion between two people could ripple outward, transforming the fate of nations. Their fall was not just military, it symbolized the passing of an age. With Thebes crushed, Macedon rose, and soon all of Greece bowed beneath Alexander's banners. Yet the memory of the Sacred Band endured not as a curiosity, but as a challenge to every generation that followed. What if love, the most private of bonds, could shape the destiny of an entire people? If Thebes used love as a weapon, the wider Greek world placed another emotion at the very heart of its society: hospitality. Known as Xenia, this sacred duty was not mere politeness. It was law, morality, and religion, woven together, enforced not by magistrates, but by Zeus himself, in his role as Zeus Xenios, the protector of strangers. Imagine yourself in ancient Greece. You are a traveler dusty from the road, arriving at the gates of a house in a village you have never seen before. You carry no letter of introduction, no coin to offer for lodging. Yet, by tradition, you have a right to knock. The master of the house is obliged to welcome you, to offer food, water, and shelter, before even asking your name. To turn you away was not only shameful, it was sacrilege, a defiance of Zeus that might invite ruin upon the household. The ritual followed clear steps. First, the host washed the traveler's hands, a gesture of cleansing both dirt and bad fortune. Then came food and wine, a place by the hearth, a bed for the night. Only once the guest was refreshed did questions follow. Who are you? From where do you come? What brings you here? This order preserved dignity, reminding everyone that a stranger might be a god in disguise. At the end of the visit, it was customary for host and guest to exchange Xenia gifts tokens to be kept by their descendants. These gifts acted like ancient passports. Centuries later, when their children's children met, they could call upon the bond of their ancestors and claim hospitality again. Xenia was thus more than a single act. It was a contract that outlived individuals, binding families across generations. But Xenia was fragile, and its violation could trigger catastrophe. Greek myths are riddled with warnings. Think of Paris of Troy, welcomed as a guest in Menelaus's house, only to betray that sacred trust by abducting Helen. The outrage that followed ignited the Trojan War, remembered for centuries as a divine punishment for broken hospitality. Or recall Odysseus's wanderings in Homer's Odyssey, where the suitors of Penelope abused the laws of Xenia by feasting and drinking in his hall without right. When Odysseus returned, their slaughter was framed not as vengeance alone, but as justice for violating Zeus's law. Even in daily life, Greeks feared the consequences of neglecting hospitality. Stories circulated of entire lineages cursed for turning away strangers, their crops failing, or their houses struck by lightning. To dishonor a guest was to dishonor Zeus himself, and that was an offense no city could afford. This intertwining of morality and religion made Xenia a cornerstone of diplomacy. Greek city-states often used guest friendship to formalize alliances. A Spartan general might recall that his grandfather once hosted an Athenian envoy and so extend protection. In a world of shifting loyalties and constant war, hospitality became a rare form of continuity, a thread of trust when treaties crumbled. The sanctity of Xenia also reveals a paradox. The same Greeks who left infants to die on hillsides, who enslaved entire populations, also enshrined in their culture a profound respect for the stranger who crossed their threshold. To the helot, or the abandoned child, Greek society could be merciless. But to the passing traveler, it offered bread wine and shelter, in fear of the god who might be hidden beneath rags. Hospitality was not simply kindness, it was survival. In a world without hotels or formal infrastructure, a traveler's life often depended on the generosity of strangers. The rules of Xenia ensured that even the poorest wanderer could hope for safety. And through these rituals, Greeks bound themselves to each other and to the gods in ways that shaped not only their daily lives, but the great epics that still echo in our imagination. Every loaf of bread shared, every cup of wine poured, carried with it the weight of divine law. Hospitality was theatre. But unlike Caligula's Rome, it was not a theatre of cruelty. It was a theatre of trust, a fragile play performed across Greece each day with Zeus, watching as both audience and judge. If hospitality under Zeus revealed how Greeks honored strangers, another custom shows how they structured bonds within their own society. Relationships between older men and youths, known as pederasty. To modern ears, the word is fraught with unease, but in the Greek world, it carried a mixture of mentorship, intimacy, and social ritual. It was not universal, nor was it uniform across all city-states, yet it was deeply woven into Greek ideas of education, loyalty, and even citizenship. Picture Athens in the 5th century BCE. Boys of noble families were sent to gymnasia, places where physical training and intellectual discussion merged. These were not simply schools, they were stages of civic preparation. Here, young men called eromenoi might attract the attention of an older citizen, the erastes. This older figure was expected to guide the youth, teaching him rhetoric, military skill, and the art of civic duty. Ideally, the relationship was framed as educational, first affectionate, second, though the line between mentorship and desire was often blurred. In Athens, philosophers themselves wrestled with this practice. Plato, in his Symposium, praised the notion of love between men as a ladder leading from physical attraction to the love of wisdom itself. Yet in other works, such as the Laws, he condemned physical consummation as vulgar, unworthy of the higher ideals of philosophy. The tension in his writings reflects the broader tension of Greek society, seeing in these relationships both a noble educational bond and the risk of exploitation. In Sparta, the practice took on a martial character. Spartan boys were raised in the agoge, the state's military training system. Older warriors were expected to form close bonds, with youths teaching discipline, courage, and the harsh lessons of war. Affection was seen as a way to deepen loyalty on the battlefield, not unlike the principle behind the Sacred Band of Thebes. A Spartan youth was told that shame before his mentor was worse than defeat in combat. But we must not romanticize blindly. The imbalance of power was real. An established adult citizen paired with an adolescent still learning his place. Some relationships may have been truly affectionate, bound by shared ideals and mentorship, but others likely crossed into coercion. Even in antiquity, voices of criticism existed. Comedians mocked predatory older men. Laws in some city-states restricted such bonds to preserve the dignity of freeborn youths. Yet, the persistence of pederasty across centuries tells us something about how the Greeks imagined the passage into adulthood. It was not merely biological. It was social, shaped through bonds with elders who embodied ideals of manhood. In their eyes, love could be a teacher, desire a bridge to discipline and intimacy, a method of instruction. To the Greeks, this was not hidden vice, but part of the public world. Painted vases show scenes of courtship, an older man offering a hare or a rooster, symbols of affection to a youth. Such gifts were tokens of pursuit, presented not in secret, but in a language recognized across society. These artifacts remind us that what we call education was for them intertwined with eros, with love and attraction, shaping the very citizens who would one day govern, fight, and lead. Modern readers recoil at the power imbalance, and rightly so. But to understand Greece, we must see how they fused pedagogy with passion, seeing in these bonds a method of molding character. Whether in Athens, where rhetoric and philosophy were exchanged, or in Sparta, where endurance and loyalty were drilled, the relationship between Orestes and Eromenos was considered a cornerstone of social order. It is one of the starkest examples of how ancient Greece was both dazzlingly brilliant and profoundly alien. For them, the pursuit of wisdom and the pursuit of beauty could be one and the same, even when it blurred boundaries that later ages would draw sharply. When most people today think of Athenian democracy, they imagine an enlightened assembly of citizens debating lofty ideals beneath the marble columns of the agora. Yet hidden in that very system was a practice both pragmatic and chilling ostracism. Once a year, the Athenians would gather not to elect leaders or pass laws, but to decide whether someone among them was simply too dangerous, too ambitious, or too disruptive to remain in the city. The process was deceptively simple. Citizens would scratch a name on a shard of broken pottery, an ostrakon, and deposit it in the public square. The fragments survive by the thousands, with names like Themistocles Aristides and Simon etched into their surfaces. If a quorum was reached and one man's name dominated, he would be exiled for 10 years. No trial, no defense, no charges, just the judgment of the people scattered across clay. For the Athenians, ostracism was not seen as punishment, but as prevention. The city had lived through tyranny, the rule of Pisistratus and his sons, and the collective memory of oppression still haunted them. Ostracism was their safety valve, a way to remove potential tyrants before they could consolidate power. By sending a powerful figure away, they preserved the fragile balance of democracy. At least that was the theory. In practice, ostracism was messy political and deeply human. Factions used it to eliminate rivals. Friends turned against friends. Themistocles, the brilliant strategist who saved Athens at the Battle of Salamis, was later driven into exile by ostracism. Aristides, nicknamed the Just, supposedly earned his fate because ordinary citizens grew tired of hearing his virtue praised. It was democracy at its sharpest edge, protecting the city, but cutting down even its heroes. Imagine the atmosphere in the agora on the day of an ostracism vote. Tens of thousands of citizens crowded the square pottery shards clutched in their hands. Some had scratched names days before, preparing in advance. Others borrowed a stylus to quickly inscribe a rival's fate. Whispered campaigns spread. Vote against Cimon. He's too close to Sparta, or remove Aristides. He stands in the way of new leaders. The tension hung thick in the air. For everyone knew the exile's life was about to change forever. And yet ostracism was strangely merciful compared to other ancient punishments. The ostracized man did not lose his property nor his citizenship. He could return after 10 years with no stigma attached. Some even returned to positions of influence. It was exile without disgrace, a political tool designed to diffuse conflict without bloodshed. Still, imagine being told by your fellow citizens, your neighbors, your comrades in war, that you were no longer welcome in the city you had served. Archaeological finds add texture to this practice. Ostraka discovered in Athens carry hastily scrawled names, sometimes accompanied by insults. Callias the thief, or Megacles, who sleeps with his sister. These fragments reveal not just political calculation, but raw emotion, resentment, jealousy, suspicion etched into clay. Democracy, for all its idealism, was not free from the pettiness and grudges of ordinary life. Ostracism reminds us that Athenian democracy was never perfect. It was radical for its time, yet it was also precarious, balancing liberty with fear of collapse. The Athenians understood that power tends to grow to gather around ambitious men, and they designed ostracism as a blunt instrument to cut it down. Whether it worked as intended is another question. In some cases, it may have prevented tyranny. In others, it may have deprived Athens of its best leaders just when they were needed most. What's certain is that this practice reveals a side of democracy. We often forget that it is not just built on ideals of freedom, but also on mechanisms of control. To the Athenians, liberty was worth protecting, even if it meant wielding exile like a scalpel. For us today, ostracism stands as a reminder. Democracy is powerful, but it can also be ruthless, and the will of the people can both safeguard and destroy. To understand the moral code of Athens, one must step into the dim light of its private homes, where the boundaries of loyalty and betrayal were judged not by love, but by honor. Adultery moikeia was among the gravest social transgressions in Greek society, not because it betrayed affection between husband and wife, but because it violated the sanctity of a man's household, his oikos. The laws were stark and merciless. If a husband discovered another man in his wife's bed, he had the legal right to kill the intruder on the spot. The orator Lysias, in one of his surviving speeches, justifies exactly this act. A husband catching his wife's lover and striking him down, insisting it was not murder, but justice. To the Athenians, adultery was not simply an affair of passion, it was an assault on lineage inheritance and masculine authority. Yet, the double standard was glaring. A man could consort with prostitutes, courtesans, and slaves without social consequence. His excursions into brothels or symposia were tolerated, even expected, as outlets for desire. But if a woman strayed, her punishment was devastating. An adulterous wife could be cast out of her home, stripped of dowry and social standing. In some cases, she might be forced into prostitution, her shame displayed for all to see. The contrast reveals a society deeply invested in controlling female sexuality. Women were expected to remain within the gynekeion, the women's quarters of the home, secluded and unseen. Their role was reproduction, producing legitimate heirs whose bloodlines could not be doubted. Adultery endangered this fragile system. If a child were conceived outside marriage, it threatened not only the family's honor, but also the stability of inheritance. For this reason, the law weighed heavily on women, while men enjoyed freedoms cloaked as necessity. Literary sources reinforce this harsh reality. In Euripides's tragedies, the adulteress often meets a violent end, consumed by shame or punished by divine justice. Even in comedies like Aristophanes' Lysistrata, where women wield sexuality as political leverage, the humor depends on the strict cultural boundaries of fidelity. These plays reflected a world where a wife's virtue was not her own, but her husband's possession guarded jealously against intrusion. And yet cracks existed in this system. The heterae, educated courtesans, occupied a liminal space, free to converse with men, attend symposia, and even influence politics. They were mistresses rather than wives outsiders who embodied male pleasure without endangering the legitimacy of heirs. In this way, Greek society created two categories of women, those to be controlled and those to be consumed. Consider the fear that must have permeated Athenian homes. A wife lived under constant surveillance. Her movements restricted, her reputation fragile. A single accusation of moikeia could ruin her life. Meanwhile, men wielded the threat of exposure like a weapon, using the law to guard their honor with lethal precision. Imagine the whispers in the agora when news spread of a wife caught in betrayal. The scandal rippling through the city, reputations shattered overnight. The hypocrisy is as clear as the sun over the Acropolis. Athens, the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and art, was also a society where freedom was unevenly distributed, where justice was bound to gender, and where the same act that left men untouched condemned women to ruin. The laws of adultery remind us that even in the world's first great democracy, equality was a dream, still out of reach, twisted by fear of dishonor and obsession with control. If the Athenian home was a place of suspicion and control, the streets and groves of the city offered something far different, the wide horizons of thought. For the Greeks, philosophy was not confined to marble halls or cloistered study rooms. It was a living practice carried into gymnasia, marketplaces, and shaded gardens. To philosophize was to walk to debate, to breathe the same air as the polis, while pursuing truths that reached beyond it. Plato's academy, founded in a sacred grove outside the city walls, was not merely a school, it was a landscape of learning. Students gathered beneath olive trees, discussing the nature of justice, the immortality of the soul, and the structure of the cosmos. There were no lecture halls with fixed benches. Instead, ideas flowed as freely as the breezes off Mount Lycabettus dialogue, moving between teacher and student, framed by the rhythm of footsteps along worn paths. Aristotle, Plato's most famous pupil carried this method further at his Lyceum. There walking became integral to instruction. It is why his school earned the name peripatetic, from the Greek word for strolling. Knowledge was not static, but dynamic, unfolding with each pace. Students absorbed lessons on logic, ethics, biology, and politics as if they were part of the natural world itself, learning to see connections between the flight of birds overhead and the laws of human society. But perhaps no figure embodied this open-air philosophy more vividly than Socrates. He had no school, no written treatises, no sacred grove. His classroom was the Athenian agora, the bustling heart of the city. Amid vendors shouting prices for olives and fish, Socrates would stop passers-by with his disarming questions. What is virtue? What is justice? What is the good life? He made philosophers out of artisans and soldiers, coaxing them into dialogue until they realized how little they knew. This method, the elenchus or Socratic questioning, unsettled as much as it enlightened. Many admired him, but others resented the discomfort he sowed. To be asked whether you truly understood what courage was, while standing among your peers, was both humbling and humiliating. Yet, through such public dialogues, Athens became a city where philosophy was not a rarefied discipline, but part of daily discourse. The practice of philosophy in public space also reflected deeper cultural values. For the Greeks, education was not about memorization, but about shaping the soul paideia, the cultivation of character. Debate in the open air mirrored democratic life, citizens speaking, questioning, challenging one another. It is no accident that philosophy flourished in the same soil as democracy. Both demanded conversation, both thrived on disagreement, both sought truth through the clash of voices. Imagine walking through Athens at sunset, the Parthenon glowing gold above the Acropolis. In the agora below, clusters of people stand in animated discussion. Some argue over trade disputes or political decrees. Others debate metaphysics, the soul's immortality, or the motion of celestial spheres. Philosophy was not locked away in dusty manuscripts. It was lived, spoken, embodied in the rhythms of civic life. There was beauty in this intimacy between city and thought, but also danger. Socrates himself became the most famous casualty of Athens' philosophical openness. His relentless questioning was eventually deemed subversive, his influence on youth threatening to the city's stability. In 399 BCE, Athens condemned him to death for impiety and corrupting the young. He drank the hemlock calmly, choosing to honor his principles over his life. The trial of Socrates remains a paradox. The city that gave birth to philosophy also executed its greatest philosopher. And yet, the legacy of open-air philosophy endured, from the academy to the Lyceum to the Stoas, covered colonnades where Stoic philosophers later taught. The Greeks turned their city into a living library. Each plaza, each grove, each shaded walkway became a classroom where thought could be tested against experience and truth, debated under the eyes of gods and citizens alike. It was here, in these open spaces, that the foundations of Western philosophy were laid not in silence, but in the noisy, vibrant chorus of a city alive with questions. To live in the Greek world was to live under the constant shadow of justice, both divine and civic. For all their brilliance in art, philosophy, and politics, the Greeks were never hesitant to wield death as punishment. Yet for them, execution was never merely the removal of a body from the world. It was a statement, a spectacle, a warning, etched into the memory of the community. The most familiar case is that of Socrates, whose quiet refusal to flee Athens before drinking hemlock made his death into a philosophical martyrdom. His execution in 329 BCE remains the most famous in Western history. But Socrates was only one among many. Across city-states, methods of punishment varied, often brutal, always symbolic. In Athens, stoning was among the most common penalties for crimes deemed sacrilegious or threatening to the social order. A crowd would gather each participant, throwing stones, until the condemned collapsed beneath the weight of communal judgment. The violence was not only physical, but civic. Each stone flung a reminder that the polis itself had chosen to erase one of its members. Sparta, ever harsher in its discipline, had its own brutal ways. One was the cliff at Mount Taygetus, notorious in legend as the site where unwanted infants were exposed. Yet, adults too could be cast from its heights. To be hurled into the abyss was to be denied dignity, stripped of burial, and left to the vultures. The drop itself was an act of exile beyond human community, a literal fall from the order of the polis into the void. Poison, though less dramatic, carried a quieter weight. The drinking of hemlock was considered almost ritualistic, a civic ceremony cloaked in solemnity. The condemned seated in public would ingest the fatal draught as witnesses observed. Death came slowly as numbness crept upward from the feet, a bodily demonstration of law's inexorable power. For a city that cherished reasoned debate, the hemlock became the ultimate silencer. Other punishments crossed into the realm of spectacle. Some cities influenced by contact with Persia or later Rome practiced crucifixion or impalement, particularly for slaves or foreigners accused of heinous crimes. Though rare, these methods left bodies suspended, displayed for days along roadsides, turning suffering into deterrent. The message was clear. The body was not only killed, but used. Its pain transformed into civic theatre. Perhaps the most feared punishment of all was the denial of burial. The Greeks believed deeply that without proper rites, the soul wandered restlessly, unable to cross into Hades. To leave a corpse unburied was to condemn it to eternal unrest. This is why the fate of Polynices in Sophocles' Antigone carried such horror, his body left exposed to dogs and birds, his spirit barred from peace. Burial was not simply a family duty, but a sacred obligation to the gods below. To refuse it was to erase not only life, but afterlife. The choice of punishment often revealed what a city valued. Crimes against religion, sacrilege, impiety, desecration were punished with ferocity. For the gods' favor was survival itself. Political threats, whether treason or tyranny, brought exile, poison, or the public disgrace of ostracism. Sexual crimes, particularly adultery, could mean death for the intruding man, while the woman bore lifelong shame. Each act of punishment became a mirror of collective fear, a stage where the anxieties of the polis were played out upon a single body. Yet, death could also become strangely honorable. A general defeated in battle might choose suicide rather than capture, turning disgrace into defiance. Warriors sometimes fell upon their own swords, echoing Homeric heroes whose deaths became songs. Even criminals could embrace execution as a chance to face destiny with dignity. Socrates himself transformed punishment into philosophy, showing that to die with integrity was to defeat injustice. Walking through an ancient Greek city, one might encounter a public square where the corpse of a criminal hung, denied burial, a warning to all. One might hear the distant murmur of a crowd hurling stones or whispers of a citizen forced to drink hemlock while friends wept nearby. Punishment in Greece was not hidden. It was woven into civic life, a reminder that law and death walked hand in hand. Behind the beauty of temples and theatres lay this darker reality, a society that believed peace of the city required the sacrifice of individuals. And in their punishments, we glimpse not only cruelty, but belief. The conviction that justice extended beyond the grave, that the gods themselves watched how mortals treated the dead. If punishments in Greece revealed its severity, festivals revealed its release. The same culture that hurled stones in judgment also paraded through city streets, carrying giant wooden phalluses, laughing, singing, mocking. In these moments, restraint broke apart, and sexuality, fertility, and humor filled the air. Religion and revelry were not opposites in Greece. They were companions. One of the most striking examples was the festival of Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and theatre. At the great Dionysia in Athens, citizens gathered by the thousands not only to watch tragedies and comedies, but to participate in processions that were bawdy ribald and unashamed. Phallophoroi men carrying enormous phallic symbols marched through the streets, symbols of fertility and life force. The procession mixed laughter with prayer, acknowledging that the power to reproduce and to laugh were both divine gifts. Even more startling to outsiders was the Adonia, a women's festival dedicated to Aphrodite and her lover Adonis. The rituals began with mourning. Women wept for Adonis's death, beating their chests, wailing in public, overturning order with their grief. But mourning soon shifted to celebration of his rebirth with songs and dances that openly expressed desire. Gardens of Adonis. Small pots of quickly sprouting, quickly withering plants symbolize the fragility of life and passion. Outsiders might have seen chaos. Participants knew they were honoring cycles of death and renewal. At times, these festivals blurred the line between reverence and indecency. Comic plays performed during the Dionysia included crude jokes, sexual innuendo, and even visual gags involving actors with padded bellies and oversized leather phalluses. Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, turned obscenity into social commentary, ridiculing politicians, philosophers, and even the gods themselves. To laugh at the powerful was, in its own way, an act of civic freedom. Why were phallic symbols and erotic jokes tolerated, even celebrated? Because fertility was not merely private, it was public survival. The Greeks knew their city-states depended on children, crops, and vitality. To honor sexuality openly was to honor the forces that sustained life. What might seem obscene today was for them sacred performance. And yet these festivals carried layers of meaning. They were safety valves releasing tensions that built under strict civic order. They inverted roles, women led rituals, slaves sometimes mocked masters, comedians insulted generals. For a few days, hierarchies loosened. But by allowing release, the festival reinforced the normal order once they ended. Laughter, desire, and parody restored balance to the serious rhythms of civic life. Imagine standing in ancient Athens during the Dionysia. The smell of wine and roasting meat fills the air. Musicians play flutes while actors prepare backstage, their masks waiting. A procession of men bearing absurdly large phalluses stirs both laughter and solemnity. The crowd cheers, some embarrassed, others exhilarated. And somewhere in the distance, a chorus rehearses lines that will make citizens weep by sundown. This was Greece, at its most human, tragic, and comic disciplined, and wild, sacred, and shameless. The festivals remind us that the Greeks were never one thing. They were philosophers and revelers, soldiers and comedians. Their gods demanded both dignity and laughter. And through these rites, they gave their communities moments of collective ecstasy, a reminder that life in all its strangeness was worth celebrating. High in the shadow of Mount Parnassus, where cliffs rose like the walls of a sacred amphitheatre, and laurel trees whispered in the wind, lay Delphi, the navel of the world. To the Greeks, this sanctuary was no ordinary shrine. It was the place where Apollo himself spoke through his priestess the Pythia, and where city-states and kings sought answers that could change the fate of empires. Imagine climbing the sacred way, a winding path lined with gleaming treasures, statues of bronze and marble, golden tripods, and elaborate treasuries built by rival city-states to boast of their victories and curry Apollo's favor. Pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean, their offerings glittering under the sun, each gift an attempt to secure the god's blessing. The air carried the mingled scents of burning incense laurel leaves and the faint sulfur rising from the fissures deep beneath the temple. At the heart of it all sat the Pythia, chosen from among the women of Delphi. On ritual days, she purified herself in the Castalian spring, chewed laurel leaves sacred to Apollo, and took her seat upon a tripod above the chasm. From cracks in the earth, vapors were said to rise, drawing her into a trance. Her voice, often fragmented and frenzied, was caught by priests who shaped her words into verses. What emerged was rarely straightforward. The oracle spoke in riddles ambiguous enough to fit many outcomes, yet weighty enough to be believed as divine truth. The power of the oracle was staggering. City-states consulted her before launching wars, planting colonies, or passing new laws. Individuals came seeking guidance on marriage, trade, or punishment. A simple answer could set armies in motion or halt them in their tracks. In 480 BCE, when the Persians threatened Greece, Athens consulted Delphi and was told to trust in their wooden walls. Some believed it meant fortifications on land, but Themistocles insisted it referred to their navy. Guided by this prophecy, Athens evacuated its citizens and built its fleet, leading to their decisive victory at Salamis. But ambiguity also sowed ruin. Croesus, king of Lydia, asked whether he should attack Persia. The oracle answered that if he did, he would destroy a great empire. Convinced of success, Croesus marched and destroyed his own. The oracle's brilliance lay not only in divine mystery, but in political subtlety. Priests at Delphi were well informed, gathering news from pilgrims and ambassadors. Their riddles were less predictions than mirrors, reflecting possibilities with enough vagueness to remain true no matter the outcome. Yet, to the Greeks, these were not manipulations. They were revelations. The god was not meant to dictate fate, but to guide mortals toward reflection and choice. The oracle's ambiguity forced petitioners to examine their own assumptions, their ambitions, their fears. In this sense, Apollo did not merely tell the future. He tested human wisdom. Delphi was more than prophecy. It was ritual performance and spectacle. Processions filled the sanctuary. Sacrifices were offered at the great altar, and festivals honored both Apollo and Dionysus, whose presence lingered in winter months when Apollo was said to depart. The sanctuary was alive with music, poetry, and competition, as well as prayer. Every visit to Delphi was a reminder that the sacred and the civic were inseparable. Even today, the ruins of Delphi carry an uncanny weight. The theatre still gazes over the valley of olive groves stretching toward the Gulf of Corinth, as if waiting for choral hymns to echo again. The temple's foundations stand silent, but the stones remember the thousands who once climbed here with questions burning in their hearts. To the Greeks, Delphi was proof that the divine touched the human world not in clear commands, but in whispers of possibility. Its oracles shaped battles, births, and burial decisions. They wove uncertainty into the fabric of Greek identity, reminding all who listened that destiny was never a straight path. It bent, it twisted it, invited interpretation. And in that uncertainty lay the very essence of human freedom. When the breath of life left a Greek body, what followed was not silence, but ritual. To the ancients, death was not an ending, but a passage. And how that passage was managed determined whether a soul found peace in the underworld or wandered restless between worlds. The preparation began immediately. Family members, usually women, washed and anointed the body, laying it out on a bier within the household. Laurel wreaths or myrtle garlands adorned the corpse, while the face might be covered with a cloth. Friends and relatives came to pay respects, their cries of lamentation echoing through narrow streets, weaving grief into the fabric of the city. Professional mourners sometimes joined their voices, piercing and rhythmic, a chorus of sorrow meant to honor the dead and alert the gods. The Greeks believed that without proper rites, the soul would never find its way to Hades. Thus, a coin, often an obol, was placed in the mouth or upon the eyes of the deceased. This was Charon's fee payment to the ferrymen who rowed souls across the dark river Styx. Without it, the spirit was doomed to linger on the riverbanks, a ghost denied entry into the afterlife. The image of the ferryman, a grim and tireless haunted Greek imagination for centuries. Burial or cremation followed, depending on region and era. In Athens, cremation became common, the ashes placed in painted urns and buried with offerings of pottery, weapons, or jewelry. Elsewhere, bodies were lowered into graves lined with stone, marked with stelae, gravestones carved with tender images of farewells. Some show a husband clasping his wife's hand, or parents touching their child for the last time. These scenes remind us that though millennia divide us, their grief was achingly familiar. Secondary burial was another custom, especially in rural communities. After the flesh had decayed, bones were gathered and reburied, sometimes in collective tombs. This act symbolized continuity of care, ensuring the soul was not abandoned even after the first burial. The dead were remembered through ongoing offerings, libations of wine, honey, and oil, poured at the grave or food left for the spirit. Forgetting the dead was a grave sin. Remembrance was a civic duty. But beyond ritual lay deep fear. The Greeks dreaded dying without burial, for an unburied corpse meant eternal unrest. This terror threads through their literature. Think of Sophocles' Antigone, where the heroine defies the king to bury her brother, proclaiming divine law above human decree. Denying burial was the ultimate disgrace, extending punishment beyond life into eternity. The geography of the afterlife, as the Greeks imagined it, was both grim and grand. After crossing the Styx, souls entered Hades' realm, a shadowy kingdom where all mortals dwelt regardless of their station in life. Yet, not all fates were equal. The wicked might be cast into Tartarus, a pit of torment. The virtuous or heroic, however, could reach the Elysian fields, a realm of green meadows and eternal joy. Between these extremes lay the asphodel meadows, where ordinary souls drifted in a grey half-existence, neither punished nor rewarded. What mattered most to the Greeks was not eternal reward, but eternal remembrance. A hero achieved immortality not through paradise, but through kleos glory. The song of memory carried forward by poets. For ordinary men and women, the tomb and its rituals were their shield against oblivion. To be buried, honored, and remembered ensured that the soul would not vanish into darkness. Consider how this belief shaped daily life. War dead were retrieved at great cost so they might be honored with funeral games. Families saved wealth for proper burials, sometimes more than they could afford, fearing disgrace if their loved ones entered Hades unprepared. Even coins found in excavated graves today still gleam faintly with that ancient fear and hope, the last toll for the ferryman. Death for the Greeks was not private. It was communal, civic divine. It bound family, city, and cosmos together in ritual obligation. The living mourned, but also ensured the dead were not forgotten, because to be forgotten was to die twice. In most Greek households, women lived behind walls, the gynoeceum. The women's quarters kept wives, mothers, and daughters apart from the public sphere. Their days revolved around weaving child rearing and managing domestic slaves, while public life debates, festivals, symposia belonged to men. Yet not all women in Greece were confined to silence. A small, extraordinary group lived outside this narrow space, the hetairae. Hetairae were not wives nor ordinary prostitutes. They were courtesans, trained in conversation, educated in philosophy, skilled in music and dance. Unlike Athenian wives, they could move freely in public, attend banquets, and even engage in political discussion. Men valued them not only for their beauty, but for their intellect, their ability to flatter, debate, and inspire. In a world where most women's voices were excluded, hetairae wielded a rare power, the power of presence. The most famous of them was Aspasia of Miletus, companion of Pericles, the great statesman of Athens. Ancient writers tell us she hosted gatherings of philosophers, politicians, and artists in her home. Socrates himself is said to have conversed with her, admiring her wit. Her influence was such that comic poets mocked her as the hidden hand guiding Athenian policy, the foreign woman who shaped the destiny of the city. Though their words were often hostile, they betray an uneasy respect for a woman who stepped beyond traditional bounds. Hetairae lived paradoxical lives. They were celebrated and scorned, desired and derided. Unlike wives who were married for alliances and children, hetairae chose their lovers, cultivated patrons, and sometimes amassed fortunes. Some owned property, commissioned art, and even funded temples. Their names appear in inscriptions not as shadows, but as figures of status linked to great men and memorable deeds. In the dim light of the symposium, the drinking party, they shone brightest. Symposia were the beating heart of Greek elite culture, where men reclined on couches, drank wine mixed with water, and debated philosophy or politics between bouts of song. Wives were never present. Instead, hetairae filled the space, pouring wine, playing music, and conversing as equals with poets and strategists. They blurred the line between entertainment and influenced their words as intoxicating as the wine they served. But their freedom carried a cost. Hetairae were outsiders. They could not marry citizens nor pass their status to children. Respectable matrons viewed them with suspicion and their autonomy was tolerated only because it served men's desires for both pleasure and conversation. A hetera's influence was fragile, dependent on wit, beauty, and the favor of patrons. When fortunes turned, admiration could curdle into contempt. And yet, in their shadowed half-space between respectability and disgrace, heterae left a legacy. They challenged the silence imposed on women. They proved that intellect and charm could command power even in a society built to exclude them. Aspasia's voice still echoes because her mind could not be ignored. The contrast between heterae and ordinary wives is stark. Athenian wives were expected to avoid notice, their virtue measured by invisibility. Heterae, by contrast, lived in the public eye, their fame and infamy etched into history. They remind us that even within rigid patriarchal systems, cracks existed where women could slip through and carve out lives of agency. To the Greeks themselves, heterae were both scandal and necessity. They embodied freedom denied to most women, yet their freedom was tethered to men's desires. They could inspire philosophers, shape politics, and leave their names in memory, but only so long as they remained exceptional. Their lives tell us as much about the possibilities of ancient womanhood as they do about its constraints. On the rugged island of Crete, amid mountains that seem to tear at the sky, a ritual unfolded that bewildered outsiders. To foreign eyes, it resembled lawless violence, a kidnapping. Yet, to the Cretans, it was a rite of passage, a structured tradition with deep social meaning. This was the ritual abduction of young men by their older companions, a custom preserved in the memory of Greek writers and whispered about in later centuries. The practice was not a crime, but a ceremony carried out with the consent of the youth's family. An older man, often of noble birth and established reputation, would abduct a younger boy or adolescent chosen for his promise. The two would vanish into the countryside, into caves and hunting grounds for weeks. There, the elder would teach the younger survival military skills and the codes of Cretan manhood. The bond forged was not merely martial, it was personal, sometimes romantic, always intimate. When they returned, the youth would be laden with gifts, armor, livestock, fine cloaks. He would be honored publicly, not shamed. The abduction marked him as a man ready to join the ranks of warriors. To us, the custom blurs lines between mentorship and coercion, education and desire. Yet, within Cretan culture, it was a paradox that made sense. It tied the personal to the civic, intimacy to public duty. It was a way to prepare the next generation for loyalty, discipline, and courage qualities the Greek world prized. And Crete was not alone in paradox. Across Greece, practices that seem shocking to us were interwoven with the very foundations of civilization. Sparta exposed weak infants, yet built warriors who defined endurance. Thebes bound lovers into the sacred band, and their devotion changed battlefields. Athens gave citizens the power to ostracize their leaders, a brutal democratic safeguard. Greek religion demanded phallic processions and bawdy festivals, finding the sacred in what others would call obscene. This is the enigma of Greece. The same people who gave us philosophy, democracy, tragedy, and sculpture also sanctioned infant exposure, ritualized abduction, and institutionalized pederasty. Brilliance lived beside brutality, and the line between civic virtue and private strangeness was always porous. Their world forces us to ask, can we celebrate the genius of Greece without confronting its shadows? Perhaps that is the final lesson. The Greeks themselves did not see contradiction. They saw wholeness. To them, life encompassed both reason and passion, discipline and indulgence, cruelty and beauty. Their legacy is not purity but complexity, a civilization dazzling precisely because it contained multitudes. And so we end where we began, with the strange customs that astonish us but also reveal the raw humanity beneath marble statues and golden myths. The Greeks built temples and democracies, yet also performed rituals we struggle to understand. To study them is to stand at the edge of paradox, gazing into a mirror that reflects both the heights and depths of human possibility.